a stormy tower, 3 widows, and a secret buried for decades. Welcome to Echo Files. I am your host, Walter Finch. Drop a comment and tell me where you're tuning in. I love seeing our community grow. Let's uncover this mystery. The evening mist rolled across the little village of Nether Renford, softening the edges of cobbled lanes and turning the lanterns into hazy stars. At the northern edge of the village, where the moors began to stretch into wild, open country, the Stormwatch tower stood like a solitary sentinel against the gathering dusk. It had not served its original purpose in decades, long since the days when it had warned of sea squalls and signal fires. But the villagers still referred to it with a hushed reverence. Its windows were bricked, its door chained, and yet the tower had always seemed quietly alive, watching. Miss Jane Marple, who had come to Nether Renford for a brief stay with her old friend Mrs. Lavinia Claythorpe, was in no rush that evening. She lingered on the garden path of Claythorpe Cottage, where the autumn chrysanthemums bobbed under the weight of a fine drizzle. The air smelled of wood smoke and damp leaves. She had always been fond of the countryside at this time of year, when the world seemed both sleepy and slightly conspiratorial, as though every hedge might be hiding some secret. Inside, the lamplight spilled across the floral curtains and lace doilies of Lavinia's drawing room. The cottage was the sort of place that seemed to sigh with comfort, and yet tonight it buzzed with gossip. "Really, Jane, I don't know what the world is coming to," Lavinia said, pressing a slice of seed cake upon her guest. "I told Mrs. Greaves just yesterday that the village is not what it used to be. And then, of course, this business with the tower." Miss Marple looked up mildly from her knitting. "The tower? Good heavens, yes. You've not heard? Well, naturally you wouldn't. Just arriving this morning. Last night, sometime after midnight, they say, young Arthur Penwell swears he saw a light flickering in the Stormwatch tower. And this morning, the constable says the chains on the old door were broken clean through." "Most curious?" Miss Marple murmured. "Oh, and that's not the end of it," Lavinia continued, lowering her voice to the conspiratorial tone beloved by small villages everywhere. "Mrs. Harrow, the widow who lives at the edge of the green, found her dog barking fit to wake the dead. When she went out, she thought she saw a shadow moving across the tower's parapet. A figure in black, she says, standing stock still in the rain." Miss Marple made a soft sound, halfway between interest and sympathy, and began to roll her ball of wool back into shape where it had tumbled across her lap. She had the sort of face that invited confidences, and Lavinia, plump, excitable, and thoroughly given to embellishment, could not resist her own dramatic narrative. "Why, some of the villagers are saying it's haunted," Lavinia concluded triumphantly. "Or," Miss Marple suggested, "perhaps someone with more earthly concerns found it useful to be up there in the dark." Before Lavinia could respond, a sharp knock rattled the front door, followed by the muffled call of the village constable. Lavinia bustled to answer, nearly tripping over the rug in her haste. "Evening, Mrs. Claythorpe," said Constable Owen Briggs, stamping the damp from his boots. He was a stout young man, with an earnest face that suggested he had never quite grown into the authority of his uniform. "Begging your pardon for the interruption, but I thought you might want to keep your doors bolted tonight. There's been an incident." Miss Marple's needles paused mid-click. "An incident?" Lavinia repeated, relishing the drama. Owen cleared his throat. "Up at the tower, we found, He hesitated, glancing toward Miss Marple, as if uncertain how much to say in front of a visitor. "I assure you, Miss Marple said gently. My hearing is quite reliable, and my discretion more so. He nodded. Right then. We found a man. Dead, I'm afraid. Looks like he fell from the upper landing sometime in the night. Lavinia gasped and clutched the doorframe as though she might swoon. Dead? Oh, heavens. Not anyone we know? That's the strange bit, Owen said. No one recognizes him. Middle-aged, city sort, well-dressed, and no identification on him. The doctor says he didn't die instantly, crawled a little ways from where he landed. There's mud on the stairs inside, and the chains were cut with bolt cutters. We'll have to report it to the inspector in the morning, of course, but... He trailed off, glancing uneasily toward the moors. There's something about the whole business I don't like. Miss Marple's gaze went distant for a moment, as though she were examining the pattern of human behavior in her mind's eye. She had seen this before. Not the tower, not the rain-slicked stones, but the story beneath it. People rarely killed or risked such things without motive. Did he say anything? She asked softly. Owen blinked. Beg pardon? The man, she said. Before he died. Did he speak? Owen hesitated. Well, yes, in a manner of speaking. Old Dr. Keswick said he was half delirious. Only got out one word, and it didn't make much sense. Lavinia leaned forward. Well, what did he say? Owen shifted uneasily. Widows. The word seemed to linger in the cozy cottage, like a draft from an open door. Miss Marple folded her hands atop her knitting. Widows? She repeated, very quietly, as though filing the word into some inner cabinet for future reference. Outside, the rain began to thicken into a proper storm, and somewhere far across the moors, the empty tower loomed against the night. Within its walls, the echoes of last night's tragedies seemed almost to whisper that Nether Renford was about to discover just how many secrets could fit inside a very small village. The morning after the discovery at Stormwatch Tower broke over Nether Renford with a reluctant, gray light, the kind that clung to the thatched roofs and frosted the hedgerows with dew. The storm had passed in the night, leaving the world damp and expectant, as if holding its breath. But the village itself was already stirring, not with its usual tranquil routine of milk deliveries and clinking teacups, but with the restless energy of gossip carried like pollen on the wind. Miss Marple rose early, as was her habit, and found Mrs. Claythorpe already at the window, peering out as though the very air might bring news. They're already gathering on the green, Lavinia said, her voice a mixture of horror and excitement. I dare say half the village will have a theory by noon, and no one knows who the man is. Imagine, a stranger, dead in the Stormwatch Tower. Such a thing has never happened in Nether Renford. Well, not in my lifetime, at any rate. Miss Marple smiled faintly as she adjusted the lace collar of her cardigan. One suspects that, if we listened carefully, the village could write the inspector's report for him before he even arrives. By the time they walked down toward the green, the air was thick with speculation. A loose circle of villagers had formed beneath the leaning elm, where Mrs. Harrow was in her element. Her small terrier, yapping at anyone who drew too near, was living proof of her tale from the night before. I told the constable myself, Mrs. Harrow declared, arms folded in righteous authority. I said, that dog's never wrong about these things. He barked like the devil himself was in that tower, and I'll wager he wasn't far off. A ripple of agreement spread through the listeners. Mr. Penwell, young and sharp-nosed, contributed his part with relish. I saw the light, you know, flickering, just like a lantern. Only a fool would say otherwise. And then, bang! The chains on the door gone as if they were thread. I reckon he was a smuggler. They still use those towers, don't they? Signaling one another from the coast? Smuggling, scoffed Mrs. Greaves, who was rarely content unless she was correcting someone. Nonsense, Arthur. The man was clearly running from the law. You can see it plain as day. No identification, no explanation. Probably a criminal of the worst sort. Miss Marple listened quietly, her expression politely attentive, though her eyes were bright with the private amusement of one who understood human nature all too well. People saw what they wished to see, she reflected. And in a village like Nether Renford, a morsel of mystery became a feast for the imagination. The constable arrived soon after, flustered but trying to appear authoritative. Owen Briggs cleared his throat and announced that Inspector Ledbury from the county seat would arrive by midday to take charge of the matter. Until then, the tower would remain sealed. Miss Marple noted the word sealed and thought of the broken chains, the mud on the stairs, and the dying man's single utterance. Sealed things had a way of failing to remain so in small villages, especially when curiosity was involved. As the morning wore on, a subtle tension wound through the village lanes. Some villagers made their excuses to pass near the road to the tower, hoping for a glimpse of constables or some trace of the drama. Others remained planted in their kitchens and shops, waiting for the news to come to them. By the time Inspector Ledbury arrived, the green had begun to resemble a stage. He was a tall, clean-shaven man of middle age, whose polished shoes and brisk manner carried the scent of a larger world than Nether Renford. He surveyed the knot of villagers with a practiced eye and muttered something to Owen Briggs about keeping the gawkers away. Miss Marple and Mrs. Claythorpe observed from a polite distance as the inspector questioned the villagers in turn. He listened to Mrs. Harrow with the air of a man enduring a familiar performance, and by the time young Arthur recounted his tale, Ledbury's lips had pressed into a thin, skeptical line. "I'll need to speak with the doctor again," he said at last, his voice carrying over the green. "The man died of a fall, certainly, but whether that fall was an accident or something more is yet to be determined." A collective shiver ran through the onlookers. The word murder had not yet been spoken aloud, but it hung in the damp air like the tolling of a distant bell. When the crowd dispersed, Miss Marple wandered back toward the cottage. She did not rush. Her pale blue eyes took in the small signs that others might overlook. The way Mrs. Greaves had pressed a hand to her mouth at the mention of the inspector, though her eyes had sparkled with interest. The subtle avoidance between Mr. Penwell and a farmer she didn't yet know, as if an old grievance had flared anew under the morning's tension. And the sudden disappearance of a boy who had been lurking near the hedgerow, listening too intently for his age. "People show you what they are in moments like this," she murmured under her breath. Inside the cottage, Mrs. Claythorpe wasted no time in drawing the curtains and declaring that the village had gone quite mad. "Every last one of them is speculating, Jane. I suppose you'll say it's human nature?" Miss Marple gave a small smile. "It is indeed. Fear and curiosity are as inseparable as sugar and tea. And yet, I think, somewhere among the embroidery of their stories, the truth is already peeking through." That afternoon, the inspector returned to the tower, accompanied by Dr. Keswick. Miss Marple, in her unassuming way, took the long route through the lanes, to tend to a bit of fresh air and walking, though her eyes strayed often toward the moor. She found herself standing at the low stone wall overlooking the tower just as the men emerged, their voices faint on the wind. A strange laceration on the hands, as though he'd been holding something heavy or struggling. Dr. Keswick was saying. And no papers? Nothing, the inspector replied. Nothing at all. A man like that, well-tailored, city-bred, he doesn't just wander into a lonely tower in a storm for no reason. And that word he spoke? Widows, yes, Ledbury said sharply. We'll sort that out in due course. I want every local widow accounted for. Miss Marple's eyes followed the retreating figures. She knew the village's widows well enough, or at least she would by supper. Human beings had patterns, like stitches in a sampler. One only needed to watch long enough for the motif to reveal itself. That night, as the mist began to creep back from the moors, a lone candle flickered in an upper window of Claythorpe Cottage. Miss Marple sat with her knitting in her lap, her thoughts turning over slowly, methodically, as the pattern of the village began to form. The tower had seen something it had not seen in decades: the end of a man's life. And yet the most telling movements were not at the tower, but in the drawing rooms and kitchens of Nether Renford, where secrets, like damp kindling, waited for the smallest spark to catch fire. The following morning dawned clearer, with a pale wash of sun breaking through the damp mist, glinting off the wet cobbles of Nether Renford. But clarity in the sky did little to clear the fog of speculation that hung over the village. The night's stillness had been broken only by the occasional barking of dogs and the nervous latchings of windows, as if the entire village had tried to barricade itself against the memory of the dead man in the tower. Miss Marple rose at her usual early hour, glancing through the lace curtains to see the inspector striding down the lane, his long coat flaring like a stern punctuation mark against the village's sleepy quaintness. Clearly, he had not wasted the morning. Behind him trotted Constable Owen Briggs, carrying a small ledger and looking slightly out of breath. By the time the inspector reached the green, several villagers had, coincidentally, appeared nearby, carrying baskets or sweeping their doorsteps, though their eyes followed him intently. Miss Marple, knitting in the window of Mrs. Claythorpe's cottage, observed all this with mild interest. People in small villages could no more resist witnessing a drama than a cat could ignore a fluttering sparrow. Later that morning, the inspector made his first move toward establishing order, or at least an official theory. He convened those he considered relevant witnesses in the vicarage hall, a modest room with tall windows and the faint scent of hymn books. The gathering, though informal, carried an air of subdued theater. Mrs. Harrow sat stiffly with her terrier clutched in her lap, as if he might be called upon to testify. Mr. Penwell leaned forward in his chair, clearly relishing his role as a principal observer of the ghostly light. Mrs. Greaves hovered near the back, whispering furiously with a neighbor. Miss Marple sat unobtrusively along the wall, her pale blue eyes half-lidded over her knitting. But no flicker of movement escaped her notice. She watched the play of glances, the tightening of lips, the way a single mention of widows caused 3 sets of shoulders to stiffen. Inspector Ledbury cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the clipped precision of someone accustomed to urban crime rather than village melodrama. "We are in the early stages of this investigation, but there are some facts we can establish. A man, middle-aged, well-dressed, and as yet unidentified, died in your Stormwatch tower 2 nights ago. The cause of death was a fall, but evidence suggests he was in the tower under questionable circumstances. The chain on the door was cut with bolt cutters. No identification was found on his person. Before his death, he uttered a single word: widows. A faint murmur rolled through the hall. "Until further information comes to light," the inspector continued, "we must treat this as a suspicious death, possibly murder. My immediate priority is to learn who this man was and why he came to Nether Renford." His eyes scanned the room, lingering briefly on each face. If any of you saw strangers in the village in the past week, or noticed unusual behavior, now would be the time to speak. Mrs. Harrow sniffed, clearly affronted. Aside from my own sighting of the shadow and the barking of this dog, which I already reported, I can think of nothing. But if you ask me, the word widows says it all. We've 3 of them in this village, haven't we? Mrs. Lytton at the edge of the wood, poor Mrs. Vane on Mill Lane, and of course myself. A sinister business if ever there was one. Inspector Ledbury gave a curt nod. We will be speaking to each of you individually. Mr. Penwell cleared his throat loudly. I told the constable already. I saw the light in the tower, flickering like someone was sending a signal. That's no ordinary business. And that mud on the stairs? A man like that wasn't just taking in the view. Thank you, Mr. Penwell, the inspector said dryly. Your testimony has been noted. The meeting concluded with few useful details, but by the time the villagers spilled back into the lane, the notion of widows as a clue had taken firm root. Miss Marple overheard the whispers like the rustle of dry leaves. Speculation ran rampant. Perhaps the man was involved with one of them, hissed Mrs. Greaves to a companion. I always said Mrs. Lytton was a strange one, came the reply. Always out walking in the dusk with that black shawl, and Mrs. Vane keeps to herself far too much. Never attends church properly since her husband passed. Mark my words, she knows something. By late afternoon, the village had neatly sorted its first list of suspects, its own widows, without a shred of evidence beyond a single fevered word. Miss Marple, strolling back to the cottage with her shopping basket, reflected on this with quiet amusement. The human mind had a talent for constructing stories that fit its prejudices neatly, regardless of facts. Yet there was something in the inspector's theory she did not entirely dismiss. A dying word, especially one spoken in terror, was rarely random. That evening, Inspector Ledbury made his first formal calls. He visited Mrs. Lytton, the oldest of the 3 widows, who lived in a low, ivy-draped cottage by the wood. The villagers had whispered for years about her husband's sudden death in a riding accident, though the coroner had declared it an unfortunate but ordinary mishap. Mrs. Lytton received the inspector with the poised dignity of someone who had endured gossip before. I saw nothing, she said firmly, standing in her neat sitting room, which smelled faintly of lavender and beeswax. I was in bed before the rain started. I have not been near the tower in years. Miss Marple, who had politely accompanied Mrs. Claythorpe on a neighborly call at the same time, noted the widow's eyes did not flicker or waver. If she was lying, she was an accomplished actress. But the small tremor in her hand as she poured tea suggested some kind of unease, perhaps fear of suspicion rather than guilt. The next visit was to Mrs. Vane, a quiet woman in her early 40s, pale and withdrawn, whose house smelled of damp books. She seemed startled at the inspector's questions and wrung her hands as she answered. No, I've not been to the tower. I didn't even know about the death until this morning, she said. Why would a man like that come here? Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the mantelpiece, where a single framed photograph of a stern-looking man stood flanked by 2 unlit candles. A small layer of dust on the frame suggested it was more ornament than keepsake. The final call of the evening was to Mrs. Harrow herself. Though the inspector had already heard her story twice, she insisted on recounting it again with embellishments, presenting herself as both a witness and, subtly, a victim of the village's unfolding drama. Miss Marple thought it very unlikely Mrs. Harrow had anything to do with the stranger's death. She enjoyed the story far too much to be at its center. By the time the inspector concluded his visits, the village was awash with its first true suspicion. The widows, though innocent in all likelihood, were under the collective lens of Nether Renford. Doors would be locked a little tighter tonight, and tongues would wag even more freely. As Miss Marple sat in her guest bedroom at Claythorpe Cottage, she turned the events of the day over in her mind. She thought of the dying man's hands, scratched and calloused from some desperate grip, and his final word. She thought of the broken chain and the mud on the stairs, and she thought, with a faint smile, of how very quickly people settled on the most obvious suspect, while the truth tended to lurk quietly at the edges, waiting for a patient observer to notice. She had noticed several things today, in fact. Small, seemingly unimportant details that everyone else had missed. Details that, like stray threads in a tangled skein of wool, might one day pull the whole mystery loose. The following morning brought with it a brittle sort of calm, the kind that settles over a village holding its collective breath. Nether Renford seemed determined to go about its business as if a mysterious death had not taken place at its very doorstep. But the effort was unconvincing. Curtains twitched more often than usual, and the hum of whispered conversations followed anyone who dared cross the green. Miss Marple, with her basket on her arm, took her customary morning walk to the post office, pausing briefly to exchange mild pleasantries with the milkman. Behind her polite nods, her mind worked in its usual methodical fashion, turning over the facts and fragments of the previous days like smooth stones in a riverbed. The inspector had done his rounds. He had questioned the three widows, and though none of them had yielded anything of substance, their quiet lives were now fodder for the village imagination. Rumor had already begun to weave a net around them, particularly Mrs. Vane, whose pallor and trembling hands had made an easy target. Yet, to Miss Marple, that nervousness seemed more akin to fear of gossip than to guilt. Arriving at the post office, Miss Marple exchanged her usual pleasant greeting with Mr. Giddens, who was sorting letters with the air of a man for whom the mail was the pulse of the village. He lowered his voice as he handed her a small packet of knitting yarn. "Dreadful business, Miss Marple," he said, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of half-shared scandal. "They say the police are looking for a motor car that came through night before last. I heard from my cousin in Oakley that a car passed them on the lane around 10 o'clock, in a terrible hurry." "A car, you say?" Miss Marple tilted her head as if in mild curiosity. "I suppose that would have been rather late for any social calls in this weather." Mr. Giddens nodded eagerly. "Exactly, and the lane was slippery with all that rain. Only a fool would drive so fast in the dark." Miss Marple smiled gently, collected her packet, and drifted toward the green. It was a small detail, and she filed it away with the others. The light in the tower, the cut chain, the single word, widows, and now a hurried car in the night. By late morning, the inspector had stationed himself at the tower with Constable Briggs. He was pacing the perimeter, his boots squelching in the soft ground. Miss Marple, strolling in the same direction under the guise of stretching her legs, approached slowly, noting the officer's movements. "Ah, Miss Marple," Inspector Ledbury said, tipping his hat. He looked tired. "I suppose you're out for a walk. You villagers are indefatigable in your curiosity." "Curiosity is a habit one rarely loses, Inspector," she said pleasantly. "I was merely admiring how sturdy the tower looks for its age. Poor Mr. Claythorpe was saying it hadn't seen a visitor in years, not since the council put that chain on the door." The inspector gestured toward the entrance, where the broken chain still hung. A new padlock lying in the grass, waiting to be installed. A bolt cutter, he said grimly. Clean cut. Not something an opportunistic trespasser carries by chance. Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the damp grass near the base of the tower. There, almost unnoticed, was a patch of pressed-down stalks, as though something heavy had rested there. She bent carefully, peering at the mud. Embedded in the soft earth was a peculiar impression, half of a shoe print, broader than most village men wore and with a worn patch at the heel. "Oh dear," she said, almost to herself. "Someone must have stood here a long while. Perhaps waiting?" The inspector followed her gaze, crouching. "I'll be—" "Good catch, Miss Marple. Briggs, take note of that. It's the first clear sign we've had of how he approached." She smiled modestly. When one has spent a lifetime mending dropped stitches, one tends to notice little irregularities on the ground, too. It was then that Constable Briggs emerged from the tower, holding something wrapped in a handkerchief. "Found this under the stairs, sir," he said. "Looks like it might have been dropped in the scuffle." He unfolded the handkerchief to reveal a small silver button, dulled by dirt but clearly expensive, engraved with a faint monogram. R.V. The inspector turned it over in his palm, frowning. "Now we're getting somewhere." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though she said nothing. A silver button told her several things. It belonged to a tailored garment, likely a man's waistcoat or coat, and its quality suggested someone of means. More intriguing was the monogram. In a village like Nether Renford, initials rarely remained mysterious for long. The inspector was not slow to seize upon this. "We'll check the local records, and I'll telegraph the surrounding towns. Someone with these initials may be reported missing, or have associates who know his movements." As they left the tower, a cold wind swept over the fields, carrying with it a distant tolling from the church bell. The village felt both close and secretive. Every door and window suddenly a potential stage for whispers and lies. By late afternoon, Miss Marple had returned to Claythorpe Cottage, where Mrs. Claythorpe was steeping tea and muttering about meddlesome police. "They've upset poor Mrs. Vane terribly," she said. "She came to borrow sugar and looked as though she'd seen a ghost. Between you and me, I think the woman's hiding something." Miss Marple gave her companionable nods, but withheld judgment. Human behavior was rarely so direct. Fear could spring from many wells. Guilt, yes, but also old trauma, scandal, or even the mere threat of village gossip. After tea, she walked a short distance to the lane where she had observed the pressed grass earlier. She traced the shoe print in her mind, comparing it to the boots she'd seen worn about the village. Too broad for Mr. Penwell, too long for Briggs, and certainly not the dainty soles of any local farmer's Sunday shoes. As she walked back, she spotted Mrs. Vane standing at her gate, glancing up and down the road nervously. Her hands clutched a thin shawl around her shoulders, despite the mild evening. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, startled, as though caught doing something forbidden. "My dear, you look chilled," Miss Marple said gently. "Do take care. The damp air is very unkind to the nerves." Mrs. Vane hesitated, lips trembling, as though she wished to speak, but could not. Then, with a strained smile, she murmured, "Thank you," and retreated into her house. Miss Marple watched her go, her mind quietly turning. Fear in that woman's eyes, yes. But not, she thought, the fear of a murderer. Rather, it was the fear of someone who had seen, or knew, something she dared not share. That night, as the wind picked up and rattled the shutters of the Claythorpe cottage, Miss Marple sat at her little writing desk and reviewed the day's discoveries. A cut chain, a hurried car, a pressed patch of grass and a monogrammed silver button, and a village full of widows, each carrying their own burdens, some heavier than others. It was a puzzle with many missing pieces, but she knew from long habit that the smallest, most delicate threads often held the entire pattern together, and she was very, very good at threads. The following morning dawned misty, the kind of soft white fog that clung to hedgerows and blurred the neat lines of Nether Renford. The village looked like a painting half-finished, and the atmosphere suited the unease settling in the hearts of its residents. Inside Claythorpe Cottage, Miss Marple sipped her morning tea by the window, observing the village with the patience of a gardener watching seeds take root. Something was bound to stir today. She could feel it in her bones. Her prediction proved correct when the first peal of excitement reached her in the form of Mr. Giddens, the postmaster, hurrying down the lane with unusual speed for a man of his years. He waved a folded newspaper as he approached. "News, Miss Marple. Fresh news?" He was slightly breathless. "Inspector Ledbury says there's been a development. They found another clue. Oh, and there's talk of a stranger seen in the fields last night." Miss Marple inclined her head, the faintest glimmer of curiosity in her eyes. "How extraordinary. Perhaps you might sit and tell me everything while I fetch you a cup of tea. You do seem rather winded." Over tea and a biscuit, Mr. Giddens relayed the latest. A groundskeeper from the neighboring Oakley estate had reported seeing a figure in a long dark coat wandering near the copse by Stormwatch Tower shortly before dawn. The man had slipped away into the fog before he could be challenged. And, more sensationally, Inspector Ledbury had sent Constable Briggs to retrieve something found in the stream that ran past the base of the hill, something metallic glinting in the morning light. "They say it's a watch," Mr. Giddens whispered with relish, "engraved with the same initials as the button, RV. Imagine that. Looks like we've a murdered gentleman on our hands." Miss Marple let the words settle into the quiet kitchen. A watch and a button, both monogrammed. Items like that were personal, not the sort a man would discard without reason. If the man with the initials RV was the victim, then he had been close enough to leave his possessions behind. But where was the body? The first real twist came a little after midday, when a ripple of alarm spread through the village. A second crime had been discovered. Not another body, but a break-in, at the vicarage of all places. Miss Marple arrived at the vicarage to find the Reverend Phelps in a state of deep consternation. His study had been ransacked, papers strewn, drawers open. Mrs. Phelps hovered in the hallway, wringing her hands. "It's a terrible violation," she said, her voice quavering. "Who would do such a thing? We've nothing of value beyond the parish records." Inspector Ledbury was already on the scene, taking statements. When he saw Miss Marple, he sighed with a mixture of relief and wariness reserved for those whose presence inevitably complicated his investigations. "It's connected, I've no doubt," he muttered. "Whoever broke into the vicarage was looking for something specific. The Reverend swears nothing's missing, but I'll be surprised if that's true." Miss Marple glanced around the room, her eyes moving with quiet precision. A lifetime of knitting and needlework had honed her ability to notice patterns, and more importantly, disruptions in them. On the bookshelf, where dust lined the upper edges of most volumes, there was a clean gap where a large tome had recently been removed. "Reverend," she said gently, "I couldn't help but notice a missing book here." The vicar looked startled, then turned pale. "Why, yes, our register of local histories and family records." "How odd. I thought I had simply lent it to Mrs. Claythorpe weeks ago." Miss Marple smiled faintly. I believe that particular book may be rather more significant than you imagine. As the police dusted the study for fingerprints, a largely symbolic effort in a village unused to scientific methods, Miss Marple stepped outside for a quiet breath of air. There, at the edge of the gravel path, she saw something most would have ignored: the faintest scuff mark where a heel had twisted in haste. It was broad, worn at the edge, the same kind of heel that had left the impression near the tower. By evening, the village was a hive of speculation. People whispered of thieves and vagrants, of murders and ghosts. Some swore the tower was cursed, that the silent widows were omens come to life. The widows themselves, Mrs. Vane, Mrs. Locksley, and Mrs. Trent, had retreated behind closed doors, rarely venturing out except for milk or post. It was that evening, just as dusk settled in streaks of violet and gray, that the second twist revealed itself fully. Constable Briggs arrived at Claythorpe Cottage with his cap in his hands. Miss Marple, the inspector said you might be of help, he said sheepishly. We found something. Well, someone did. The gardener at Oakley found a man's coat tucked behind the old hay shed. It's soaked and muddy, but the label inside reads RV plain as day, and there's blood on the cuff. Dear me, Miss Marple murmured, her eyes lowering in thought. A coat, a watch, a button, but still no body. And there's more, Briggs said, shifting from foot to foot. The vicar checked with the old records. Seems there's only one person in the area with those initials. Roland Venn, a businessman from London who came to stay with his cousin in Oakley a fortnight ago. No one's seen him since the storm. Miss Marple's fingers paused on her teacup. Roland Venn, a newcomer just passing through, a blank slate in a village that prided itself on knowing everyone's secrets. She thought of the widows, of Mrs. Vane's trembling hands and frightened eyes, of the broken chain and the ransacked vicarage. A story was beginning to form, though it was not yet complete. Tell the inspector, she said softly, that I believe Mr. Venn's disappearance is no random misfortune. Someone here knows precisely what happened to him. That night, while the wind moaned softly over the hedgerows, Miss Marple sat alone in her parlor, a small pool of lamplight surrounding her knitting. She counted stitches, her mind running alongside the thread. A stranger arrives. A storm rages. A light in the tower. A chain cut clean. A monogrammed button and a watch. A coat. A smear of blood. A vicarage ransacked for its records. And 3 widows, silent as the grave. It was the silence, she reflected, that spoke the loudest. People in fear of injustice might plead or explain. But people in fear of exposure, they became terribly, utterly quiet. By the time she set her knitting aside, Miss Marple was certain of one thing. The game had shifted. The first death or disappearance was only the beginning. And before the truth emerged, the village of Nether Renford would have to confront sins it had kept buried for decades. The following day broke under a heavy sky, swollen with the threat of rain, and the air in Nether Renford was thick with the weight of both the weather and unspoken fears. The discovery of Roland Venn's coat had sent the village into a nervous frenzy. Though no body had yet been found, the villagers spoke of him in the past tense, as if death had been confirmed by the whisper of the hedgerows and the silent judgment of Stormwatch Tower. Miss Marple, as ever, began her day with quiet observation. She strolled through the village, under the pretense of a leisurely morning walk, noting every closed curtain and every figure that lingered too long in a doorway to gossip. Silence and chatter were equally telling. for each reflected the tremor of guilt or curiosity rippling through the population. By the time she reached the post office, she was in possession of more than a few murmured tidbits. Mrs. Claythorpe claimed she had seen Mrs. Vane at dawn, walking the back lane toward the old orchard. Odd for a woman who usually stayed indoors until well after breakfast. And Mr. Penworthy, the milkman, had heard a dog barking frantically near the vicarage the previous night, though he swore the noise stopped abruptly, like someone had hushed it sudden. The real turning point, however, came mid-morning, when Inspector Ledbury requested Miss Marple's presence at the vicarage. He had swallowed his pride sufficiently to acknowledge that her eyes often noticed what his overlooked, though he would never admit aloud that he relied on her insight. "Miss Marple," he said as she entered the ransacked study, "we've had another development." On the vicar's desk lay the missing book of local family histories, retrieved from a hedgerow behind the churchyard. Its leather cover was scuffed and damp, the corners smeared with earth. But the more intriguing discovery was a folded sheet of paper tucked inside, marked with a neat ink circle around a name: Jonah Vane, 1889 to 1912. "Family records," Ledbury said, frowning. "I'll confess I don't see the significance. Some local ancestor. But why steal it, then abandon it?" Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and studied the page. "Because someone wanted to know something very specific," she said softly, "and having learned it, had no further use for the book." The inspector gave a short huff, a mix of skepticism and reluctant attention. "You think this relates to our missing man?" "I should be very surprised if it did not," Miss Marple replied. "Roland Venn came to visit a cousin, yes? Would that cousin be Mrs. Vane, the widow living in the cottage by the lane?" "Yes," the inspector said slowly. "Why?" Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the name circled in ink. "I believe, Inspector, we are dealing with more than a simple disappearance. This is a story rooted in the past and in families where sins, if I may say so, have very long shadows." By afternoon, the village was abuzz again, for the inspector had summoned Mrs. Vane to the station for questioning. She arrived draped in her habitual black, hands trembling against the handle of her umbrella. She looked every inch the grieving widow, but Miss Marple, sitting unobtrusively in a corner, observed the subtle signs: the twitch in the left eyelid, the way her fingers fussed endlessly with the clasp of her handbag, the dart of her eyes toward the clock, as if measuring how long she must endure the ordeal. "Mrs. Vane," Inspector Ledbury began, "you are Roland Venn's cousin. When did you last see him?" "On the night of the storm," she whispered, voice quavering. "He said he might go for a walk, to see the tower and the lightning. I begged him not to. I have seen too much tragedy tied to that place." "Did he mention anyone he was meeting?" She shook her head, tears welling. "No, he seemed restless, like a man with something on his mind. He was a quiet guest, kept mostly to himself." Miss Marple spoke then, her tone as soft and harmless as ever. "My dear, I wonder, did Mr. Venn ever ask about your family history? Or perhaps mention an interest in old village records?" Mrs. Vane's fingers froze on her handbag. The pause was small, but it was there, a falter in the rhythm of her performance. "Why? Yes," she said at last, carefully. "He asked about my late husband's family, about Jonah. I told him the boy drowned in the mill pond. It was a long time ago." Miss Marple inclined her head, offering the gentlest smile. "Of course. So tragic, losing a child." When Mrs. Vane departed, visibly shaken, the inspector turned to Miss Marple with furrowed brows. "All right," he said. You've seen something I've not. Out with it." Miss Marple folded her gloved hands. Roland Venn was not strolling aimlessly in the storm, Inspector. He was seeking something, or someone. He may have discovered a secret that certain members of this village have labored to keep buried for decades. Jonah Vane did not, I think, simply drown. That would not require such careful silence from the widows. Ledbury swore under his breath. "You think the widows are in on this?" "I think," said Miss Marple gently, "that guilt can bind people more tightly than marriage ever could. And it has a way of echoing through generations, waiting for the right or wrong visitor to stir it up." Evening came early beneath the rain-laden clouds, and with it, a new layer of unease. Miss Marple returned to her cottage, where she lit her fire and let the soft crackle fill the room as she knitted. Outside, the first raindrops tapped against the window. Her mind, as always, moved in patterns and stitches. Roland Venn's sudden interest in family histories, the theft of the record book, the silent terror in Mrs. Vane's eyes. The chain cut clean at the tower, a coat bloodied, but no body. As the storm finally broke, sending rivulets racing along the cobbled lanes, Miss Marple rose from her chair and peered out into the darkness toward Stormwatch Tower. A faint light flickered once more behind the narrow slit window, then vanished. Someone was there, and if Miss Marple was right, the next move would bring the long-buried secret into the open, or result in another tragedy before the night was done. Rain lashed against the windows of Claythorpe Cottage that night, its relentless drumming mingling with the distant rumble of thunder over the moors. Miss Marple sat in her chair by the hearth, knitting needles paused mid-stitch. Her eyes, keen and unwavering, were fixed on the flickering glow that had appeared once more in the narrow slit windows of Stormwatch Tower. For a moment, she simply observed. The light flickered, disappeared, then returned. A nervous, uncertain illumination, not the steady beam of a lantern set down, but rather the trembling glow of a handheld candle. Someone was inside the tower, and they were moving. Miss Marple rose, fastening her shawl about her shoulders. She moved with the quiet decisiveness of a woman half her age. Outside, the rain soaked her in seconds, but she paid it little mind. The streets of Nether Renford were deserted. Not a soul braved the storm. Only the wind and the whisper of dripping eaves accompanied her up the narrow lane toward the hill. At the base of Stormwatch Hill, the path was slick with mud. She climbed slowly, gripping the handle of her umbrella like a cane, and paused when she reached the shadow of the tower. The light within had vanished, but the echoes of movement carried faintly through the stone, footsteps and the faint scrape of metal. Then came another sound, voices. She strained to hear, but the storm swallowed the words. Only fragments reached her, fearful, tense. Recognizing the futility of lingering in the rain, she decided on a different approach. She would wait, just out of sight, behind the thick trunk of a yew at the edge of the copse. It was a wise choice. Minutes later, the heavy door of the tower creaked open. A figure emerged first, a woman in a dark cloak, her posture stooped as though the weight of years and worry pressed her down. Mrs. Locksley. She hesitated at the threshold, glanced about furtively, and then beckoned to someone within. A second figure stepped into the rain, taller and more rigid in posture. Mrs. Vane. Her face was drawn, lips pressed to a thin line. They descended the path quickly, holding the hems of their skirts above the mud. Miss Marple watched as they disappeared toward the lane, their heads bent close together in whispered conversation. A third figure emerged a moment later. Mrs. Trent. Unlike the others, She carried a lantern and looked about with sharp, wary eyes. She lingered longer, scanning the darkness before locking the tower door and hurrying after her companions. Miss Marple waited until the echoes of their footsteps faded. Then she climbed the final few steps to the heavy oak door. She knew better than to attempt entry tonight. The tower was a secretive place, but secrets had a way of leaving traces behind. Instead, she noted the deep scuff marks at the threshold, the kind made by dragging something heavy. A chill passed through her. By the time she returned to her cottage, the widow's secret was no longer a question of if, but of when it would break. She dried her shawl by the fire, poured herself a small cup of cocoa, and considered what she had witnessed. 3 widows, bound together in secrecy, sneaking to the tower in the dead of night during a storm. And always, it seemed, when the village was certain Roland Venn was gone. Morning brought the storm's aftermath. Branches scattered in the lanes, waterlogged fields, and a community stirred into renewed anxiety. Gossip traveled faster than the milk cart. Someone had seen the widows walking late the night before, and now every tongue wagged with suspicion. Miss Marple paid a visit to Inspector Ledbury, who was sipping tepid tea in the station while scanning the damp pages of his notes. "You've heard, I presume," he said without looking up. "Half the village swears they saw the 3 widows sneaking about like specters in the rain." "I have heard," Miss Marple said, settling her shawl. "And I have seen. They were at the tower." Ledbury's head snapped up. "You're certain?" "Quite. I was near enough to recognize them." He swore softly. "Then that does it. They're involved. Must be. I'll bring them in for questioning." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "No, Inspector. Confront them now, and you will gain nothing but rehearsed denials. Fear is often a more eloquent informer than interrogation. Allow them one more day to tangle themselves in their own web." He frowned, but he knew her well enough by now to heed the advice. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a call to Mrs. Locksley under the guise of delivering a jar of quince jelly. The widow received her in a parlor that smelled faintly of lavender and damp wool. Her hands shook as she poured tea, and her eyes darted toward the curtained window whenever a cart rumbled by. "It's kind of you to visit, Miss Marple," she murmured, voice frail. "Terrible weather, isn't it? Dreadful business with Mr. Venn. I do hope he's found safe." Miss Marple let the silence stretch a beat longer than politeness dictated, then said softly, "You must find the nights very long, my dear, especially with the memories the tower must hold." The teacup rattled in its saucer. Mrs. Locksley's lips trembled, but she forced a brittle smile. I don't know what you mean." But Miss Marple did not press. She had planted the seed, and seeds, she knew, grew best in the dark. That evening, as dusk fell, she observed from her sitting-room window once more. The lane was quiet. The widows' cottages shuttered. Yet her instincts prickled with the certainty that the night would not remain still. She was right. Near midnight, a muffled clatter came from the direction of the tower, a sound like something metallic striking stone. Miss Marple, ever prepared, wrapped herself in her rain-cloak and ventured into the night. This time, she took the back path along the hedgerows, approaching the tower from the opposite side. Through a crack in the crumbling masonry, she saw the faint glow of a lantern and heard voices raised in urgent, fearful whispers. "We can't keep it here any longer. If they search, we're finished. It should have been left in the river, as we said." Then came a sound that tightened Miss Marple's chest with both dread and grim understanding. the scraping of stone on stone, as though a concealed trapdoor or flagstone was being moved. She waited until the light was doused and the footsteps receded. Only then did she creep forward to the base of the tower. The heavy oak door was still locked, but she had no need to enter. The scuffed mud and drag marks told her the rest. Something, or someone, had been hidden here. As she made her way home through the wet night, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the human heart. How it could twist itself into knots of loyalty and guilt, and how it could lead ordinary people to unthinkable acts. She knew the moment to act was drawing close. Tomorrow, she decided, she would pay a visit to the vicarage, and she would bring with her a quiet plan to expose the truth before the silent widows made a move that could not be undone. Morning came to Nether Renford with a deceptive calm. Sunlight broke weakly through thinning clouds, glinting on the rain-washed lanes and sparkling in the hedgerows. But beneath that brightness, tension gripped the village like a coiled spring. Word of the widow's nocturnal wanderings had spread, carried on the unerring wings of gossip. Mrs. Claythorpe at the post office spoke of it as though she had seen the scene herself. 3 cloaked figures, like mourners from the grave, slipping toward Stormwatch Tower under the storm. Miss Marple moved through the village with her usual air of quiet purpose. She stopped to chat with the grocer, admired Mrs. Penworthy's dahlias, and even exchanged a few harmless words about the weather. But all the while, her mind worked ceaselessly, arranging and rearranging the threads of the mystery. The missing Roland Venn, the stolen family record, the dragging marks at the tower, and the guilty glances of the 3 widows. She had decided that today would be the day. If the truth was to come out, it must be coaxed with care, like luring a bird into the open rather than snatching at it and sending it into panicked flight. Her first stop was the vicarage, where the study still bore the faint scent of damp parchment and pipe smoke. Inspector Ledbury was waiting, tapping his pen against a stack of notes. He looked up with visible relief. "Miss Marple, I was just about to send for you. The widows are still silent as the grave, but the village is about ready to storm the tower with pitchforks, if I don't act soon." "You will act," Miss Marple said calmly, removing her gloves. "But first you will listen. I have a plan." Ledbury sighed, but nodded, leaning back in his chair. "You will announce," she continued, "that a formal search of Stormwatch Tower is to be conducted this evening in the presence of witnesses. Make it public. Let the widows hear it." He blinked. "And give them time to hide whatever they're hiding?" "Precisely," she said, her eyes twinkling. "Guilt is a most restless companion, Inspector. It drives people to movement, and when people move, they leave traces." By late morning, the news had spread. The constable made the rounds with conspicuous solemnity, informing each household of the planned search. Mrs. Locksley was seen peering from behind her lace curtains, pale as milk. Mrs. Vane clutched the fence post in her garden, as though it were a lifeline. Mrs. Trent, the sternest of the 3, simply nodded once, but her lips were bloodless, pressed thin. Miss Marple spent the afternoon in a quiet vigil. From her sitting room window, she watched the ebb and flow of village life. The widows scarcely emerged, though once she saw Mrs. Trent hurrying along the lane, a dark parcel clutched to her chest. The moment came just after dusk. Clouds drifted across the rising moon as Inspector Ledbury, accompanied by a small knot of villagers and 2 constables, approached the foot of Stormwatch Hill. Miss Marple walked among them, a small, unthreatening presence, but one whose calm eyes missed nothing. The widows were there too. They had arrived in a cluster, silent, their black garments merging with the growing dark. Mrs. Vane's hands shook visibly. Mrs. Locksley clutched a handkerchief to her lips. Mrs. Trent stood rigid, jaw set in a defiance that seemed forced. The inspector raised his lantern, casting a beam across the weathered stones of the tower. "Right then. Let's have a look inside." The heavy oak door creaked open, and the smell of damp stone and mildew wafted out. The lantern light cut a narrow path through the circular chamber, illuminating little more than a spiral stair and the rough floor. At first, nothing seemed amiss. There were no immediate signs of a struggle, no obvious evidence. But Miss Marple walked slowly around the edge of the room, her sharp eyes scanning every stone, every shadow. At last, she paused near a flagstone in the center of the floor, where a faint smear of mud caught the lantern's glow. "This one," she said softly, tapping it with her cane. Ledbury and the constables pried it up with some effort. The sound of stone scraping on stone echoed ominously in the hollow space below. When the slab finally lifted, the lantern light revealed a shallow cavity lined with old bricks, and within it, a sodden burlap sack. The crowd murmured in shock. The widows swayed like trees in a sudden gust. "Out with it," the inspector barked, though his voice shook. The constable heaved the sack out and untied the rope that bound its mouth. From within tumbled Roland Venn's walking stick, his hat, and a bundle of waterlogged papers, the missing pages from the family history book. But there was no body. The murmurs swelled into a buzz of disbelief. Ledbury turned sharply to the widows. "I think it's time you explained yourselves." For a long moment, none of them spoke. Then Mrs. Vane, trembling as though a dam within her had finally cracked, whispered, We only wanted to protect the truth." "Truth?" Ledbury snapped. "Hiding a man's belongings under a stone slab is hardly innocent." Miss Marple stepped closer, her voice gentle yet firm. "I think the truth, my dear, is that Roland Venn discovered a secret you three have carried for many years. He knew that Jonah Vane, the boy in the records, did not drown by accident, did he?" Mrs. Locksley began to sob softly, wringing her hands. Mrs. Trent stiffened, but her eyes glittered with a cold, hopeless light. Miss Marple continued, each word measured. "The three of you were young then, children playing by the mill pond. There was a quarrel, a push, perhaps, a moment of panic. Jonah died. You swore to one another it would remain buried. Your husbands kept the secret too, until time made widows of you all. And Stormwatch Tower became the keeper of your guilt." Mrs. Vane nodded, tears spilling freely now. "Roland found out. He said he wouldn't tell. But he wanted us to confess. He went to the tower that night to confront us. We begged him to keep silent for the sake of the families. He left, but he dropped his things in the storm. We thought if we hid them, the questions would stop. We never heard him. We only wanted the past to stay buried." Ledbury's face was grim, but Miss Marple's tone was unexpectedly kind. "The weight of childhood guilt is a terrible burden, my dear. But secrets have a way of calling to the light, just as storms call to the tower." From the doorway came a sudden shout. "Inspector, he's alive!" Roland Venn, bedraggled but very much living, staggered into the lantern glow, supported by a young constable. He had been found sheltering in a shepherd's hut on the moor, disoriented and chilled but unharmed. Gasps and cries of astonishment rippled through the gathered villagers. The widows clutched each other, faces awash with relief and shame. Roland's voice was hoarse. I left to think. The storm caught me. I meant no harm, but I wanted them to face it at last. The boy, Jonah, deserved that much. Miss Marple watched the scene with a soft, inscrutable expression. The truth was now out, and though it would not lead to prison, it would leave a mark far deeper than any legal punishment. The widows would live on in their cottages, bearing the weight of the village's knowledge. Stormwatch Tower would remain, silent and solemn, a monument to secrets that refused to stay buried. And Miss Marple, as ever, would return to her knitting, knowing that human nature had played out its familiar, tragic melody in the quiet lanes of Nether Renford. Evening settled over Nether Renford with a solemn hush, the kind that follows the lifting of a long-held secret. Lanterns glimmered along the narrow lanes, their golden light catching the wet cobbles and glistening hedges, while the last murmurs of gossip faded into the soft rhythm of crickets and distant owl calls. Inside the vicarage, a small gathering had formed by Inspector Ledbury's request. One final meeting to untangle the truth and let the village exhale. Miss Marple sat by the hearth, her knitting needles quietly clicking, though her eyes missed nothing. Across the room, the three widows sat close together, black shawls drawn tight as if to shield themselves from judgment. Mrs. Vane trembled with every exhale, Mrs. Locksley dabbed at her eyes with a frayed handkerchief, and Mrs. Trent stared into the fire, her jaw rigid, but her gaze distant, hollow. Roland Venn, pale but recovering from his ordeal on the moor, leaned against the mantelpiece with an air of hesitant authority. He had insisted on this meeting, not for vengeance, but for closure. Inspector Ledbury cleared his throat and addressed the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, as you're all aware, the incident at Stormwatch Tower is resolved. But I feel it is best that all remaining confusion be put to rest tonight. There has been enough whispering and enough fear. Miss Marple has kindly agreed to explain what she has pieced together." The inspector glanced to her, both grateful and slightly in awe of the quiet, unassuming woman who had steered this investigation more than any official procedure. Miss Marple lowered her knitting and folded her hands in her lap, her voice soft yet clear. "My dear friends, the truth of this matter is both sad and, I think, a lesson in how the past is never as buried as we hope. To understand what happened these last few days, we must go back many decades, to the day little Jonah Vane disappeared from the village." The widows flinched, almost in unison. Murmurs rippled through the small circle of attendees, which included the vicar, Mrs. Penworthy from the post office, and Mr. Cray, the miller, each leaning forward to catch every word. "Jonah Vane," Miss Marple continued, "was 10 years old. He drowned in the mill pond, or so the official story went. But even at the time, some whispers lingered that it was an odd accident. The three of you," she nodded kindly toward the widows, "were there that day. Children yourselves, caught in a quarrel that turned in an instant to tragedy. A push, a slip, perhaps a moment of panic. No malice, only fear and the unforgiving water." Mrs. Locksley began to sob again, quiet hiccups shaking her thin shoulders. Mrs. Vane covered her face. Mrs. Trent sat stiff, refusing to give the village the satisfaction of tears, though her knuckles were white against her lap. "Your families chose silence," Miss Marple said gently. "The adults feared scandal, and the village, over time, forgot. Or pretended to. But guilt has a way of lingering, like the echo of a bell long after it's rung. And Stormwatch Tower became the keeper of that secret. You watched it from your windows. It was a constant reminder of what you had buried in your hearts." Roland Venn shifted, his voice hoarse but firm. "And then I came, poking into family records, trying to piece together my mother's history and the story of her brother Jonah. I noticed the gaps, the inconsistencies." Miss Marple nodded. Yes. The missing pages from the parish record, which the widows later tried to hide beneath the tower's floor, were proof enough that someone had tried to erase the past. And when Mr. Venn confronted you during the storm, the weight of that old fear returned. Inspector Ledbury crossed his arms, speaking now with measured firmness. So, instead of speaking the truth, you tried to hide the evidence, his walking stick, his papers, under that flagstone. And when he went missing after the storm, well, the whole village believed the worst. Mrs. Vane whispered brokenly, "We thought if we hid the things, the questions would stop. We thought the tower would keep our secret again." Miss Marple's expression was one of quiet compassion. But the human heart, my dear, is rarely so cooperative. Secrets demand release, and storms, you know, have a curious way of bringing hidden things to light. The room fell silent but for the soft crackle of the fire. The weight of years, the guilt, the fear, the relief, seemed to settle in the warm lamplight like dust after a collapse. At last, the vicar spoke, his voice grave but gentle. "This is a matter for the conscience more than the law. A childhood accident, long past. No earthly court could punish you more than your own hearts already have." Inspector Ledbury grunted, but did not disagree. He had little appetite for a trial over a tragedy 4 decades old, especially when the supposed victim now stood alive in the room. The widows nodded faintly, each in her own shadowed world of remorse. Outside, the wind rose and rustled the last wet leaves in the churchyard, as if the village itself released a long-held sigh. For the first time in many years, Stormwatch Tower stood empty of its burden. Its stones were just stones again, cold, worn, and mute. Later, as the gathering dispersed and the villagers returned to their homes, Miss Marple walked alone down the lane toward her cottage. The night air was cool, carrying the faint scent of wet earth and wood smoke. She paused once to glance back at the silhouette of the tower against the moonlit clouds. Stormwatch Hill would be quiet now, she thought. But human nature would go on as it always had, weaving its small tragedies and tender mercies through the lives of ordinary people. She reached her gate and slipped inside, where her little sitting room awaited with its gentle clutter of books and wool. She set her knitting aside and allowed herself a moment of reflection. Another village drama concluded, another reminder that truth, however long delayed, always finds its way home. And with that thought, Miss Marple poured herself a cup of tea, the steam curling like a soft ghost in the lamplight, and began the final row of her scarf. The next morning dawned bright and clear over Nether Renford, as if the storms of the past days had been nothing but a bad dream. The sunlight stretched across the village green, glinting on the wet cobbles and sparkling in the leaves that still clung to the sycamores. Yet, beneath the freshness of the air, an almost imperceptible hush lingered, a quiet awareness that the heart of the village had been stirred and would not soon forget it. Miss Marple rose at her usual hour, her small cottage already warmed by the embers she had coaxed to life in the hearth. A pot of tea steamed on the table, and her knitting lay neatly folded beside it. She paused by the window, watching as the milkman's cart rattled past and a pair of children, bright scarves fluttering, ran down toward the green. Life in Nether Renford was returning to its rhythm, though shadows of the recent drama flickered quietly in the corners. By mid-morning, the village had begun to hum with its gentle gossip. In the bakery, Mrs. Penworthy and Mr. Cray whispered about the widow's pale faces, seen peeking from behind lace curtains. In the post office, the vicar's wife relayed the news that Inspector Ledbury had decided no formal charges would be brought. For there had been no malice in Jonah Vane's death all those years ago. Only the tragic thoughtlessness of childhood. Still, the weight of exposure had changed the widows forever, and the village, for all its kindness, would not soon stop looking at them with a mix of pity and curiosity. Miss Marple ventured out, her sturdy shoes crunching on the gravel as she made her way toward the green. She had been invited to the vicarage for a light luncheon, a quiet gathering, a moment to close the book on the strange chapter that had unfolded. The vicar received her warmly at the gate. "Ah, Miss Marple, the sun has returned," as though heaven itself were sighing in relief. She smiled softly. Storms often have that effect. They take something away and leave something behind. Though it isn't always pleasant, it is cleansing. Inside, the sitting room was cheerful with the smell of toasted bread and jam. Roland Venn was there, looking far healthier than he had 2 days ago. A bandage still wrapped his left hand, but there was color in his face now. He rose to greet her with a warm nod. "I wanted to thank you," he said, "for everything. I fear I owe my life to your insistence that the truth be followed, however tangled it seemed." Miss Marple tilted her head in her characteristic way, her eyes twinkling. "I did very little, Mr. Venn. I merely listened. People will often tell you more than they intend, if one is quiet long enough. And you, young man, were determined enough to rattle the ghosts out of their tower." The vicar poured tea as Roland settled back into his chair. "I will leave Nether Renford soon," Roland said after a pause. "I think I've learned what I came for, though not in the way I expected. My mother always spoke of her brother as a shadow in her memory. Perhaps she suspected the truth all along. I shall bring her peace, at least, when I tell her the story's complete." Miss Marple nodded gently. "That is a worthy purpose. Family history can weigh heavily if it is left with too many unanswered questions." For a moment, they all listened to the birds outside. Starlings gathering on the thatch, chattering like excited witnesses to the drama that had just ended. The world was moving on, as it always did. That afternoon, Miss Marple walked the lane toward Stormwatch Hill one last time. The tower loomed against the brightening sky, its gray stones gleaming after the storm's wash. The air smelled of damp heather and the faint mineral tang of the moor. The grass along the path was flattened where villagers and constables had trampled it during the search for Roland. But now it was only she who walked there. At the base of the hill, she paused and rested her hand against a weathered fence post. The tower seemed less ominous now, stripped of the whispers and weight of its secret. It was just an old building, empty of its ghostly burden. Human guilt had haunted it more thoroughly than any spirit ever could. Miss Marple reflected on the widows, on their shared silence, their lives bound together not by love or even friendship, but by a single, terrible moment in childhood. A moment that had ruled them for decades. It was, she thought, a profound reminder of the peculiar nature of human hearts. How guilt can twist into companionship. How fear can masquerade as loyalty. And how truth, once revealed, has the power to both destroy and heal. By the time she returned to her cottage, the afternoon sun had begun to mellow into gold. She put on the kettle and opened her small journal, in which she sometimes recorded observations. Not of cases, exactly, but of the curious patterns of human behavior. She wrote, 3 women, bound by fear. 1 man, seeking truth. A storm to sweep away the dust of years. It is not lightning that strikes the hardest, but conscience. She closed the journal and laid down her pen. Through the window, she watched the last light of the day slip behind the trees, casting the village in a warm, forgiving glow. The green looked the same as it had before the storm, and yet, in the way small English villages always did, it had changed forever. That evening, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting in hand. The scarf she had started in the first days of the storm was nearly finished, soft and warm in her lap. As the stitches clicked quietly in the firelight, she thought of the widows, of Roland Venn, and of the tower now standing silent on the hill. Human nature, she mused, was as old as the stones of Stormwatch itself, capable of cruelty, cowardice, and unspoken love all at once. It was a tapestry of secrets and small mercies, of mistakes and reckonings. And as long as she lived, Miss Marple knew she would continue to watch, to listen, and to understand, for there was no end to the lessons that ordinary lives could teach those willing to see. Outside, the wind shifted softly, carrying with it the scent of evening rain and the distant toll of the church bell. Nether Renford exhaled into the night, and the storm, at last, belonged to memory. The village of Nether Renford exhaled a long, collective sigh the evening the final truth emerged. A soft mist drifted from the moor, wrapping the cottages in a gentle shroud, as if to soothe the raw nerves left behind by the storm and the confessions it had unearthed. In the vicarage drawing room, a small fire flickered, casting a warm glow over the circle of villagers who had gathered for the last time. Inspector Ledbury stood by the mantel, his uniform neat, but his expression weary. Across from him, Miss Marple sat with her knitting folded neatly in her lap, the familiar glint of quiet understanding in her pale blue eyes. The three widows, Mrs. Vane, Mrs. Trent, and Mrs. Locksley, huddled together like a single dark figure, their hands clutched tightly in their laps. They had not spoken much since the partial confessions of the night before. But tonight the final piece of the puzzle would settle the matter entirely. Roland Venn sat to one side, pale but resolute, the bandage on his hand a silent reminder of the storm and the tower's treacherous secrets. The vicar had placed a tray of tea and scones within reach, though no one seemed inclined to eat. Inspector Ledbury cleared his throat, nodding to Miss Marple. "Perhaps," he said in a tone of mingled respect and curiosity, "you could explain it, Miss Marple, better than I can. I believe the village would rest easier hearing it from you." Miss Marple inclined her head, her voice gentle but clear. "It is a story that began many years ago, when three young girls played by the mill pond with a small boy named Jonah Vane." A shiver passed through the widows, their eyes fixed on the carpet. "The boy," Miss Marple continued, "fell into the water and drowned. There was panic, of course. And then, silence. Your families protected you, thinking it an accident best left unspoken. But that silence bound the three of you together for life, first in fear and then in a sort of secret companionship, built on guilt and shared memory." Mrs. Locksley's lip trembled. Mrs. Vane wept silently. "When Roland Venn arrived in the village," Miss Marple went on, "he disturbed the careful stillness you had built. His questions, his visits to the tower, his determination to learn the truth of his mother's brother Jonah, all of it tore at the fabric of your secret. The storm merely hastened the unraveling. You believed he would expose you, and so you acted out of fear once more, hiding his walking stick and papers under the floor of the tower. You wished the storm to take him, as the pond had taken Jonah, to keep your secret safe forever." Inspector Ledbury shifted uneasily but said nothing. Miss Marple's voice softened, almost like a lullaby. But fear, my dears, is a poor companion. It drove you into mistakes, into revealing the very guilt you tried to hide. Guilt always finds a way to speak, sooner or later. There was silence, except for the ticking of the vicarage clock. Then Mrs. Trent, her voice flat and hoarse, said, "We never meant for him to die. Not the boy, not Mr. Venn. We were just frightened children, and then frightened old women." Miss Marple gave a small, sympathetic nod. "I know. Which is why the inspector, I think, will exercise mercy. The law cannot always reach so far back, and punishment has lived in your own hearts these many years." Roland Venn looked from one widow to the next, his face a mixture of sorrow and release. "I came for truth, not vengeance," he said softly. "And now, I can let it rest. My family will finally know." The widows bowed their heads, their figures trembling as the weight of 40 years finally lifted, leaving them shrunken but free. Outside, the mist thickened, but the village felt lighter. Stormwatch Tower stood silent on the hill, stripped of its terrible secret, now only an old ruin staring out at the moor. Later that night, Miss Marple returned to her little cottage. The fire was warm, her chair welcoming. She set down her knitting for a moment, gazing out the window at the faint outline of the tower in the distance. Human nature, she reflected, was as old and unchanging as those stones. Fragile in its moments of fear, cruel in its attempts at self-preservation, and yet, sometimes, capable of quiet redemption. She poured herself a cup of tea, took up her knitting once more, and listened to the soft ticking of the clock and the distant murmur of the village, settling back into peace. The storm had passed, and the truth, as always, had come home.